Ever since the release of Generation 6, Pokemon fans have been arguing over and over again about one single issue that has seemingly plagued the series ever since Pokemon entered its modern era: difficulty, and more specifically, grinding in the EXP Share. Some people say the new EXP All has reduced the depth of the games, while others believe the new EXP system makes the games playable. Of course, as with most internet discussions, there's been a lot of bad faith arguing and reduction, and as someone who has played every generation and is currently replaying them in order, I'm making this video in hopes that we can explore both sides of the issue to have a reasonable discussion about the matter and reach the honest truth by giving my own input. This video is more so focused on the EXP systems rather than the holistic difficulty of the games, but when it is relevant I will go into the difficulty too. Without further ado, let's begin. The EXP Share existed in the classic Pokemon games, generations 1 through 5, as an item that would split your EXP between two Pokemon, the one battling and the one holding the item. It was something you'd acquire after having done something or obtained some objective, and it would give you another option when managing your Pokemon team. In Generation 6 though, this was changed to an EXP All, where the participating Pokemon would gain full XP from a battle, but all of your party Pokemon would also gain 50% of the EXP, effectively multiplying the amount of XP you got from a battle by 3.5 times. This type of item did actually exist in Generation 1, but the EXP was split evenly between all of your team members, so it's not exactly the same. The EXP All has understandably been an incredibly powerful item that has boosted the power level of your teams, and people that enjoy the EXP All argue that this is undoubtedly a good thing. It smoothens out the playing process and lets you focus on the battles, cutting out a ton of grinding that only padded the games out and created artificial difficulty, which often made having a full team impossible without grinding. They also argue that basically every other RPG has a form of EXP sharing, so there should be no issue in Pokemon having it. The difficulty reduction is negligible because of this, especially since Pokemon's always been an easy series. Plenty of fan games and Nuzlockes have features to keep you at an equivalent level as many bosses, so difficulty obviously doesn't come from that. The bottom line is, it's a great quality of life feature. The anti-EXP All crowd argues that there's been a loss of depth in Pokemon and a massive crater left in the game's feel, and the EXP All has reduced the game's difficulty down to the point where they're not even worth playing because of how easy you bulldoze through everything. The rigidity before the EXP All existed was part of the experience of being a Pokemon trainer and forced you to make choices that impacted your playthrough beyond the boss fights, especially with the regular EXP Share that was still worth reusing. Now with this baseline understanding of both arguments, let's take a deep dive when evaluating them. Many of these arguments go hand in hand. The issue about difficulty, for example. The anti-EXP All crowd say that these games are made so easy because of it that they're not even worth playing, while the pro-EXP All camp says that this just isn't the case at all. And the hard truth is, the EXP All should have no bearing on whether a game is easy or not. Obviously, there is some nuance to this, so let me explain. When you have a game not built around an EXP All, but rather the classic EXP system like Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and swap in the EXP All, those games are going to get exponentially easier when you multiply the player's EXP gain by 3.5 times. But at the end of the day, the EXP system you use in a game doesn't make it hard or easy, it's the design around it. A lot of Pokemon games have the EXP All just sort of haphazardly thrown in it, like X and Y or Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, only adding to how easy those games are, especially X and Y. But it is possible to make difficult games with the EXP All. Again, it's all just a matter of design. Take Ultra Necrozma. It's almost universally considered a very hard fight in the series. 9 out of 10 players I think would agree it's on the harder end of everything in the series, whether you specifically struggled with it or not. While Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon use the EXP All, it has no bearing on the strength of Ultra Necrozma, will often one-shot a lot of your team regardless.
Please survive, please! If this
It doesn't matter how much EXP you gain or what system it is if Ultra Necrozma is meant to be so far above you to be a challenge regardless. On the flip side, going back to a game like Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, flopping in an EXP All in a game designed around the old system is obviously going to take a toll on the difficulty of the game. The problem with a lot of Pokemon difficulty is that they've taken the old system of EXP and swapped it to the EXP All without updating a lot of the design necessary for that. Oftentimes in classic Pokemon gym leaders would have a few but strong Pokemon that would match with your team. You'd either have a few Pokemon that were strong or many Pokemon that were weaker on average, but you'd have more of them. And you'd have to overcome this level gap between your Pokemon and the gym leaders with your numbers. Or your Pokemon were just strong enough to fight the gym leaders because you were focusing on a few rather than many. So when you have the EXP All, you can have a lot of Pokemon at a high level, while gym leaders still only use a few Pokemon. This is obviously going to obliterate the difficulty too. I think a lot of the reason people feel the new games are so easy is because they maintain a lot of the old design around the original EXP system while feeding you so much more EXP. But not only that, they also just give you tools that are so much more broken. In Generation 6, they straight up just hand you a Mega Charizard, a Mega Lucario, and a Mega Latios or Latias while the enemies are using Go-Go, Meowstic, and Altaria. It's no wonder that when you have all this EXP on top of these powerful Pokemon that they're going to be so easy. And this isn't even mentioning systems like Affection that are later thrown onto you. The bottom line is the EXP all isn't what makes games easy, it's the design surrounding them. You can still make fights hard in the games with this system just as you can have easy fights with the classic EXP system. Critics of the EXP all in regards to difficulty should instead aim it at the game design that isn't accounting for it. The next issue I would like to discuss is that of grinding and training your Pokemon, as well as the old leveling system being an outdated relic of the past that has no place in modern games. Both sides have a different take on it. Enjoyers of the EXP all cite three major issues with the old leveling system. 1. All modern RPGs have an EXP all adjacent system, so it's archaic design of a bygone era. 2. The game requires you to waste too much time grinding. And 3. This is compounded by the fact that grinding is just incredibly slow, and you have to spend hours shredding through wild Pokemon just to get yours up. So let's talk about them. The first argument about all modern RPGs having an EXP all adjacent system is simply false and overly reductive. Not all RPGs have this. Fire Emblem, for example, doesn't. There may be ways for all of your units to gain experience in some games, but in combat, a unit only gains EXP if they've contributed to the fight. You can have your weaker units benefit by buddying them up with a stronger one to get them EXP, but there isn't an EXP all like there is in Pokemon. But even beyond that, it is true that plenty of games do have party-wide EXP, but this neglects the nuance between games. In many RPGs, upwards of half of your party are fighting an enemy at the same time. This obviously creates an incredibly different gameplay loop and flow from Pokemon, where even double battles are rare. But even deeper than that, Pokemon is a game where switching around the Pokemon you use in battle happens in nearly every fight. While that's not much of an emphasis in other games, at least comparatively to Pokemon. Additionally, in Pokemon, the story of your party can only really be told through their encounters in battle. Take Magikarp for example. The story behind this Pokemon is that it needs a ton of support for it to evolve, to the point where it cannot feasibly fight on its own. But after you've struggled with it for a while, by switch training it, Gyarados rewards you with an almighty power you cannot find anywhere else in the game at the level you obtain it. That's not something that can be told through the campaign of a Pokemon game, but in another JRPG you may have events within the story that can tell the same thing for a party member. Also, in some games your party members just sort of leave your party for one reason or another, so if that was the party member you had been working on and you had no backup members, you'd be pretty much screwed over something you really couldn't know about. Regardless of the reasoning though, pointing to other JRPGs and saying, why shouldn't Pokemon have this mechanic, is incredibly reductive and ignores the differences in their gameplay and each individual series needs. Pokemon is its own series with its own designs that doesn't necessarily translate to others. The better question is, does Pokemon need this mechanic? And you'd have a better argument from that point of view, leading into the issue of grinding. Many players find that their teams can be incredibly lopsided in terms of level because some Pokemon just aren't getting the battles in to get up in levels to match the bosses. So you'll have to grind a lot for each fight to have your Pokemon on equal terms. And getting a new team member similarly can be incredibly grindy because of the time you have to spend to get them up to speed. To give you an example, look no further than the game most infamous of this. The one and only Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. If you ask 100 people what Pokemon game is the grindiest, you're sure to hear this game most often from Pokemon fans. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver are characterized by fights that leave you far below the boss's Pokemon, and the wild Pokemon people use to grind are too weak to give you any meaningful EXP without running around a patch of grass for hours. This is the game that appears to be the most extreme for these issues, so I'll be using it as my point of reference. Take Lance. When I was replaying Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, this was my team after the Elite Four. Ignoring the outlier that is Lugia, who is spawned in at level 45, my strongest Pokemon is 13 levels lower than his, and 9 levels weaker than the Gyarados that is his weakest Pokemon. And then there's the team I had after Red. My strongest is a whole 20 levels lower than his weakest. And again, these were after the fights, so that doesn't take into account the EXP I got during them. It is unarguable that there is a massive level gap between my team and my opponents, so what choice did I have to grind? Well, if you've been paying attention, you'd have noticed that these are my teams after Lance and Red, meaning that I defeated them with these levels. The honest truth that I have realized after replaying all of these games is that grinding has never been the solution to a battle, only the simplest one, never the best. You've never been forced to grind in Pokemon. Yes, even in Johto. There's a fundamental misunderstanding about Pokemon that you have to be on the same level as your opponents, or even close. I think this may have stemmed from the popularity of Nuzlocke, where fainting is the same as losing a team member, or ROM hacks that genuinely push you that far, but this has never been the case in vanilla Pokemon. In fact, the game tells you the opposite, and this is where we move into another anti-EXP all argument. Pokemon has always been about the strategy you take into your opponent. That's why there's such an emphasis on super effective moves in the game. The starting gyms are kept quite close to your level so that you aren't overwhelmed when you don't have a ton of options, but as you progress you gain access to the moves that are effective against them, so the progression of difficulty changes. You have access to their weaknesses, and their teams are always static, so the difficulty is then created by the level gap. Your advantages become your access to super effective moves and your party member advantage, while the boss has the raw numbers in terms of where they have fewer but stronger Pokemon than you do, and eventually even that numbers advantage is eroded away as the game goes further. But the game gives you more than this. You have access to as many items as your bag can hold, status moves, and even before the battle you can seek out strong Pokemon like legendaries to help you out. But most importantly, the best toy you have is your brain. The reason that there's a massive level gap is that the game can't just exclusively be about clicking the fire type button into the fire weak Pokemon. Otherwise it's not very engaging. It has to evolve, which is the reason for the level gap. Now you're being challenged on how well you can manage your own Pokemon while also battling the opponent. Yes, Lance had Pokemon far above mine, but I have access to 4 times super effective moves against almost all of his Pokemon that I can exploit. But beyond that, I also have status moves like Thunder Wave and Yawn to help my Slowking land its Ice-type moves against his Dragonites, and allow my Pokemon free turns to heal up in a pinch. And against Red, it was a similar process, with your advantages reduced even further as you progressed into the final fight of the game, with Red having no 4 times weak Pokemon and an even larger level gap. There are so many strategies that you can use to overcome these gaps in strength, and that's what the game wants you to do. It teaches you about the worth of battle effects in the fight with Whitney's Miltank and its infamous charm and flinching stomp. Grinding is obviously the most obvious solution, but again, it has never been the best one. Even your weak Pokemon can contribute to a lot of fights in these ways. It was a different game, but my Mightyena in Emerald with Intimidate and Scary Face was an incredible help in my playthrough, allowing my other team members like Regice and Hariyama to better combat bosses. Even if Mightyena's stats were like that of a wet noodle and it didn't have a lot of good matchups, it was still an integral part of my team due to the support it offered even when it had a bad matchup. And it shows how weak Pokemon can contribute to fights through support. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, my Ampharos similarly supported my Slowking against Lance by paralyzing his Dragonites to allow my Slowking to move before them, and sometimes even get lucky with a free turn because of paralysis. Now you might point to my Lugia and say that I was using a legendary to carry me, but if you look closely you'll see between my catching Lugia and beating Lance, it only gained a single level, and it was the second lowest level member on my team against Red as well. It wasn't something I really relied on. Whatever the case, it is your job as a player to figure out how your team interacts with the bosses and figure out a plan from there, using your access to a vast array of items and status moves to get you over them. And it may take you a few tries to do this, and that's okay. It's okay to lose while you're figuring out the boss's team. It's okay to take your time and try again. And it's okay to think, well, I'm just not well prepared enough for this, and go and gather resources to try again. And even if you have to grind, if for some reason you can't get over the boss, or maybe you're just against using items and status moves, you have access to better forms of EXP than wild Pokemon. If you have access to Lance, you also have access to the previous Elite Four members that will give you way more EXP than wild Pokemon will, and money on top of that. Heart Gold and Soul Silver has a whole mechanic dedicated to giving you better fights with the rematch calls. As you progress through the game, your previous opponents will call and ask you for a rematch. Now you don't have to fight them, but if you do need the EXP, please use these sources rather than the wild Pokemon, especially since you get to call them after the radio tower and challenge them to a rematch at that point. And this extends to the gym leaders after the Elite Four as well. Now you might say that these games shouldn't make any player have to grind, but I don't think designing any game around the people in the worst case scenario should be the norm. It is a far more worthwhile experience for everyone if there is some challenge, even if a few players are left to grind. A game asking players to evolve as the game evolves itself isn't a bad thing, it's just proper game design. That said, I think there are a few fights where you might, and I say might, I didn't personally, but I'm not everyone, where you might have to grind, depending on the Pokemon you're using and your team composition, or maybe you're just not skilled enough. But these fights are exceptions rather than the rules, and they have their own context to them that require a deeper analysis of their game design in another video, not this one, sorry. But again, these are outliers, so I don't see them as very relevant to the broader discussion about the EXP systems, as even the games with the EXP all have these massive spikes too occasionally. As I mentioned, boss difficulty isn't something inherent to either EXP mechanic. Ultra Necrozma, as I mentioned before, is a difficulty spike similar to Lance and Red that arguably goes even farther than them. So to reiterate, these issues are less of an EXP system problem, but a design issue which is its own conversation separate from grinding and the EXP share. The next EXP all argument is what I actually believe to be the most relevant to the conversation, the so-called death of death. Pokemon at its core is a game about raising a team and endearing yourself to them over the course of an entire journey through a given region, at least traditionally. It's not only about the boss fights or the evil team you have to stop, it's about the little moments in between on each individual route where your team just gets that little bit stronger and the decisions you make to train them. Experience is an infinite resource due to the ability to grind, but there are also only finite sources of experience unless you want to grind. And here is where a core mechanical depth and decision making of Pokemon has been completely cut off by the EXP all. This argument is from the anti-EXP all crowd, by the way, if you couldn't tell. While we've talked about the boss battles and how you've never really been forced to grind for them if you used all the tools accessible to you, there's still a lot of time to spend before those fights begin that can create awkward scenarios. Take this Twitter user, no hate to them obviously. They struggled with wild team differentials which made some of their Pokemon unviable to be used against bosses. And here we move into another concept the EXP all has utterly obliterated: experience management. In classic Pokemon, you can use as many Pokemon as you like. You can have a few Pokemon that will be all relatively high leveled, but may struggle into a few bosses that counter them. For example, if you just use your starter Cyndaquil and a few AHM mules, you're going to struggle into Lance's entire team that resists fire. Or you can raise a variety of Pokemon that will be lower level on average, but give you more options. Think of my teams, for example. I'm taking a lot of damage, but I'm also able to dish it back to any foe with a variety of non-damaging moves as well. And managing the EXP gain of your team is part of that team building process. Gym leaders, champions, and rivals aren't the only trainers. There's also bird keepers, youngsters, and bug catchers that act as not just obstacles in your path, but key ways to keep your team around the same level, as it's your job as a Pokemon trainer to, well, train your Pokemon and choose how you do so. If you notice that one of your team members is falling behind, you need to give them the attention during these weaker fights. Of course, this also extends to your new team members that really need a lot of help to get up to speed, which is going to involve switch training, and that friction between switching your weak Pokemon into your strong guy. While it's not exactly fun, it is precisely what gives value to the training of that Pokemon. You see it go from not being able to fight on its own at all to being able to chip in to being a fully fledged member of your team, and the EXP sort of just obliterated that. When you catch a new Pokemon, you don't even have to interact with it for it to become a part of your team. You no longer watch them grow over time, not just through the numbers, but how they participate in battle over time. In Pokemon Platinum, I had to work hard to get my Bidoof to evolve. As a baby Pokemon, it needs a lot of attention and care, and I watched it change through every step of the process, from when it couldn't even win a one-on-one with a Bidoof to where it was taking down Crasher Wake as it evolved. And that's just what the game was. You had to put in the effort to support your Pokemon that needed it. I didn't have to halt my playthrough and grind the patches of grass for Bidoof. I simply had to switch train it as I progressed in my journey through the fights with the trainers on each and every route. There was friction, but that's exactly what makes you as a player feel your Pokemon change, as you don't need to switch into your stronger team members to support your Pokemon, as you see them able to fight on their own, as you see them being with the support for your new team members. And that's the memory that's part of what makes Pokemon worth playing, isn't it? And again, just because something isn't exactly fun doesn't mean it's a bad thing to have in games. I mean, most games are predicated on the fact that you can lose, and while losing isn't fun, it's precisely what makes winning enjoyable. Of course, that's an extreme example, but that's about as deep as I can go into the matter without ballooning this video's length. Seeing your team grow and evolve over time, seeing their individual strengths and weaknesses change along with that. This is exactly what the classic EXP system did for the game. You had to use all of your Pokemon. You had to see them in their weaknesses and their strengths, and the EXP all utterly shreds that. If the EXP all existed in Platinum, there'd be no reason for me to touch my Voodoo at all until it was evolved and strong enough to fight on its own. There'd be no reason to use any of my Pokemon outside of the most optimal one, as there's no cost to neglecting any of your Pokemon. Of course, you might feel that I'm just being sentimental, but this sentiment was baked into the EXP systems of the classic games. And that's why, for many players, that these new games feel a lot more hollow. But then you might say there's nothing stopping you from playing this way in the new games, but to that, again, I have to say, it being something you have to LARP rather than it being a part of the game's design makes it feel a lot more hollow, as engaging with the game's mechanics will always feel more fulfilling than just LARPing. The harmony between the gameplay mechanics and choices you make and its impact on your team, both story and strength, no longer exists, something that was part of the Pokemon game's identity as a series. But even beyond that, it also just homogenizes the way you raise teams entirely. Again, the choice between many or few Pokemon no longer exists, and Pokemon like Magikarp that used to be an incredible strain to train are no longer so. Instead, they can just simply sit in the back of your party without you having to interact with them at all. And this applies to other Pokemon like baby Pokemon and pseudo-legendaries. Of course, there are some Pokemon with unique evolution methods that do require you to engage with them, but these Pokemon are really few. And even if, hypothetically speaking, every Pokemon was designed like this from here on out, it still wouldn't fix the issues with the original 600 Pokemon made with the original classic system of EXP games. And again, it just really homogenizes the way you interact with your team and Pokemon. A lot of decision making you had to make just no longer exists. The crux of the issue with the EXP All is that it obliterates a lot of the depth that the classic Pokemon games had, while offering nothing in return except for simpler, often easier gameplay, which compounded with some of the new mechanics introduced to new generations and made the gameplay experience go from easy games that could make you think to more mindless experiences where you just put the square block in the square hole. Of course, I'm not speaking for every game. Generation 7 is a big blank for me since I haven't gotten to my replay yet, though I do remember some of the big fights like Ultra Necrozma. The moment-to-moment gameplay is quite foggy for me, so I'll have to ask you to fill me in on that on the comments section. But generally speaking, many generations do suffer from this. This is one part of the issue though, but it's not the whole. The EXP share is one thing, but the way the community interacts with the games is another. I think a big part of the reason there's been a rise of complaints about grinding and whatnot is that the younger generations who didn't grow up with these older games have grown up but aren't interacting with these games on their own terms, rather trying to force the way they think Pokemon should be played onto the games that simply aren't designed for it. But then again, can you really blame them? If you've grown up in any time between the last 12 years and now, you're going to be playing a Pokemon game with the EXP All, a system that fundamentally changes the way you interact with the game and each of your Pokemon. I mean, even when I replayed Pokemon X, I left the EXP share on just to see through the lens of the average player, and wow, I mean, yeah, I neglected all of my Pokemon except for my Mega Charizard as soon as they handed it to me, because it just steamrolled through everything. There's no reason to use anything else, unless my Charizard fainted, and even then, I was never punished for it because the EXP All had all my other Pokemon up to such a strong level anyway. And that's just the way Pokemon is played now. An entire generation grew up with games that rewarded you for only using the Pokemon that disposed of the enemy the fastest, which would often be done by just mashing a stab move with your starter, and you'd never really be punished for neglecting any of your other Pokemon because they'd pop out of their Pokeball like they'd been part of those fights too, whenever you needed them. I mean, you can't really blame people for playing this way. If you started with X and Y or any game after that, this was just the standard way of playing. There would be no reason to think anything else. But because of this, a person who's only played these newer games is naturally going to run into a wall whenever they go back to the older ones, and this strategy just isn't as effective. That said, it is on them to learn the proper way of interacting with these games on their own terms, but it isn't surprising to see them struggle. They might not even know what they're doing is wrong, especially since the EXP All is under the hood now. The game doesn't even tell you about it anymore. It's for sure a jarring shift, but the critiques against grinding and whatnot still don't go beyond the surface level of the gameplay. At the end of the day, it is on the player to figure out how a game is supposed to be played as they play it. Now, you may have watched this video up to this point and think I'm staunchly against the EXP All, but this is a video about the honest truth, the nuance between the extremes. And the truth is, there are Pokemon games that massively benefit from the EXP All. Of course, the biggest issue with the EXP All is the games aren't built with it in mind. Not just the game's difficulty, but the gameplay loop too. But there are two games that I think do greatly benefit from the EXP All. those being both entries into the Legend series. And if you know anything about them, it's that their gameplay loops are so radically different from the other games. Legends Arceus is about exploring the land of Hisui as a new frontier and learning about the environment and Pokemon, which leads you to naturally cycling around your team a lot to complete research tasks, and the EXP aids this gameplay loop. It's because you're not really building one static team, but rather raising a variety of Pokemon to fill out those research tasks. There's also not a lot of trainer battles in Legend Arceus, so the old method of training your Pokemon can't really be applied here, while at the same time you get a ton of EXP from catching Pokemon, which can often be done without even entering a battle. The classic EXP share just simply wouldn't work as well with this game. Legend ZA, on the other hand, is a complete opposite. Its gameplay loop is full of battles with NPCs, but it's a real-time system that encourages you to take the fights at a more faster pace. Even the jobbers that in old Pokemon would normally exist to help you train your weaker members end up somewhat threatening, as with the amount of damage and coverage moves thrown around in the game, you're far more likely to take a fatal blow when switching around. Having the optimal Pokemon for this situation is much more critical in this game in its moment-to-moment gameplay loop. The game structure isn't like traditional Pokemon, and because of this, the old EXP share system wouldn't work as well. Sure, that friction that was created by the old EXP share is still sort of obliterated here, but I'm not sure that would even be a net benefit to these games due to how differently they play and how that friction would negatively impact these games' fluidity, which they so rely on. Both Legends games have gameplay loops that the EXPL actively aids in, as those systems of gameplay are better built for the EXPL due to just how differently they play from traditional games. It's different, but it's not bad. It's good, even. To conclude, I would like to reiterate and clarify the points I'm making in this video. At the end of the day, the EXPL creates a completely different way of interacting with your team and the Pokemon games themselves. The moment-to-moment gameplay is a lot more hollow in the traditional games, as a lot of decision-making is completely cut off because of the EXPL, homogenizing a lot of your team training, and you don't really have to manage EXP as much. Certain Pokemon that were unique like Magikarp for being hard to train simply aren't so, because they are just able to chill in the back of your party until they're battle ready, because of the EXPL giving them passive EXP growth and killing any need on your end to train them. Of course, there is also the side effect of some of the newer games being very brainless to play, the EXPL partially contributing to this, but in my opinion this isn't the best argument against it, as a game can be designed to have difficult fights, just as a game without it can have easy fights. The conversation about difficulty should be shifted to the game design outside of the EXPL, with the conversation about the EXPL shifting towards how you interact with your Pokemon and manage your EXP becoming a lot more shallow, which is something that can't really be fixed just by adjusting a few numbers on opponents' Pokemon. Another consequence of the EXPL is creating a generation of players that try to play the games with the old system and find themselves naturally struggling and thinking the answer is to grind, which it almost never really is, but rather using the other advantages the game gives you over the boss's raw strength to overcome them. Of course, while this is naturally something you'll have to learn, the response online appears to be that of thinking that the old games are simply grind fests, which I would say is simply not the case. And again, this isn't to say the EXPL system is completely bad though. There are games that do significantly benefit from this system rather than the classic one, but this is because those games have gameplay loops that have been created to benefit from it. They might not have the team management depth that the classic era in terms of EXP management had. What they offer with their vastly different gameplay loops more than make up for it. While on the other hand, a lot of traditional battling games like Scarlet and Violet and Sword and Shield or X and Y simply don't have this design, which makes them feel a lot more hollow, which is compounded further by the lower difficulty of the newer games, but that's also created by a variety of factors. The honest truth is that it's not really as black and white as any one side would have you believe. The issue of the EXP share is one of design, and whether the game is giving you something worthwhile that the EXP share is needed for, like in the case of the Legend series. But it is a horrible match for something like X and Y or a game like ORAS that simply aren't built for these systems. And finally, I would like to give you a reminder to please not grind mindlessly on wild Pokemon in these older games. Try using some battle items or different status moves you would normally wouldn't, and if you absolutely need the EXP, there are far more efficient sources of EXP than the wild Pokemon in the grass, like Soul Silver's Pokegear or Platinum's VS Seeker. Pokemon is a series that is dear to many, but the discussion around it is often toxic and unproductive, so I'd appreciate it if we can use this comment section as a forum for civil discussion, so please no name calling or reductive statements. And if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe or hype the video. It really helps me out, but until then, take care.